So I actually had a thought on how to start this, which is there's all these like weird cultural things that happen in different countries. Like you have always a question of why is, Northern Europe more boring than Southern Europe, or why is X country funner and this one's more boring, or this one's louder and that one's quieter. Um, and it's sort of tempting to look for historical explanations, which are often nonsense because you're just looking for something that could tell the story, but there's no way of knowing whether that's actually what made it that way. But when it comes to corruption in Mexico, I have a very good historical explanation as
Oh,
to
I've got one.
where it come from.
Let's have a origin off.
All right, so mine goes like way back. This is a quote that we talked about together a couple of years ago, which
Bastard,
is
I think we have the same one.
do
Go on.
it? The law is obeyed, but it is not applied.
Okay, I think we're coming to the same point from different directions. I want to hear yours. Go on.
So I read this in I think it's a widely known thing for historians of like Spain and Spanish domains, but I read in this book that has nothing to do with Mexico. It's about the very exciting topic of salted cod prices in the Spanish domains in the 16th century.
You are
a
so
page turner.
boring.
It's actually an amazing book. It's extraordinary what this lady can do with cod prices. But anyways, there she mentions that there's this thing that was often said, and the origins of it is quite dark, but the logic behind it is repeated in the course of the Spanish Empire, which is la ley se obedece pero no se cumple. The law is obeyed, but it is not applied. And the logic behind that was that it's a pre-modern sort of world where the laws can be like turned on and off, and they apply to some people, not to others. But the logic is always that the king or the emperor is a good person and he has the best interest of his people at heart. So when a bad law comes to the land, obviously the emperor didn't want that for us, so we obviously don't need to follow it. He just doesn't know that this is bad.
By the way, that isn't pre-modern. We still hear that today. Like whenever you get like a single party, or whenever you get like a one-man, one-woman government where we all love the great leader, it's always his or her like lower echelons who are at fault. So like Stalin is never wrong. It's all his bureaucrats. López Obrador couldn't have wanted that law to go through. It must be the corruption amongst his ranks of the people who don't respect his real will, because he respects the will of the people.
That's a very good point. But I think the one big difference is like the law, even if AMLO didn't want it or Stalin didn't want it, still goes through and it still applies. And for it to no longer apply, it needs to like sort of be pushed back. But for centuries in the Spanish domains all over the world and the Iberian Peninsula, you had these laws that'd be like, well, I'm not doing that because that makes no sense. Like the king would never want that of me. And then the whole process of actually changing the law might take a century because, for the law to get to, I don't know, remote Bolivia, and then they decide not to follow, and then back to the capital of the Bolivian territory and back to Madrid and blah, blah. This takes forever. So by that point, like you're just okay. You've been okay for a century with not following a law. And that is a characteristic that sort of is a constant throughout not only the Latin American territories of Spain, but also the Philippines as well. For centuries, the Spanish domain, laws are subjective.
I disagree. Not entirely, but I disagree in a way that I think gets us further back into the origin story. Because what you're describing there, it's not wrong entirely, but I think it's very much part of the Black legend that was created around the Spanish Empire. Oh, the Spanish Empire. This is the Black legend created mostly by British and then American historians, Protestants who disdained this Catholic empire, unwieldy, inefficient, pre-modern, not capitalist enough, and therefore very corrupt. That's sort of the definition of inefficiency from this economic point of view, is corruption. And what's interesting to me is I don't think it's wrong to describe the Spanish Empire that way. It's just wrong to not describe the British Empire that way as well. Because, I mean, this isn't the United States, the podcast, but I think it's worth underscoring, for example, that a lot of the the tumult and the anger that came from this taxation without representation was the British applying the taxes that were already there and hadn't been properly applied. Like, sure, like a few taxes were added, but people were actually mostly annoyed that they weren't allowed to smuggle anymore. So I don't think it explains enough as to why Mexico is so corrupt as compared to maybe the United States. We'll get into whether or not Mexico is much more corrupt than the United States and the rest of the world, but that's like further down the conversation. But for now, I think the origins, to me, you're absolutely right, have a lot to do with distant empires and not being able to enforce the law. But I think there's a sort of step before that, and it has to do with financing. I'm going to go backwards slowly but surely. There's a wonderful explanation as to why Mexico broke down into, like, as a country and into civil war after independence. And it had a lot to do with how the Mexican government was really indebted. It didn't have enough power to impose itself. And therefore, even though it had a very liberal constitution that accounted for taxation to sustain the government and enforce the laws, it didn't have enough power to charge people that money. And so you had this terrible vicious feedback loop in which you weren't able to charge taxes because you were too weak, and because you had no money from no taxes, you were too weak to charge any more taxes. And so the government basically collapses to a great extent. But if you go back 300 years, or slightly less than 300 years before Mexican independence, that's when the Spanish are arriving into a recently subjugated Mexico, like the Aztecs are gone, they're conquering the north. What you get is this weird power vacuum in which you've got the conquistadores, who are basically low-level nobles, hidalgos, who had left Spain for adventure because they had no money in Spain, suddenly controlling these enormous riches in the Mexican Empire, now the Empire of New Spain. And the king really doesn't like this, because the king in Spain says, like, you guys are my subjects. I need to be able to impose myself onto you. And it was actually touch and go for a while. The son of Hernán Cortés, Martín, actually did an uprising. I think we talked about this in a past podcast. I can't remember which one, but like he does an uprising to become basically the king of Mexico and become independent from Spain in like the early 1600s. That would have been a very different world. It doesn't work out. They burn his house down and like salt the earth. But you still have this issue, right? As the king of Spain, how do I impose myself on this very distant land? And so he sends his bureaucracy, because really, what does the king want? He wants to tax these people. He says, fine, you can keep your encomiendas, literally your large plots of land. Encomienda, by the way, meaning I've given it to you as the king. I've encommended you with this land. But he needs to charge them in. He's got to charge them taxes, and so he sends over this vast army of bureaucrats. Now, the king, being an absolutist, he wants absolutely every single penny he charges in tax. So he doesn't give his bureaucrats any money, which is a disaster, because they're all like dropping dead from starvation, and they're begging him, please let us like find a way to charge some money so that we can like survive and do your bidding, charge the taxes. And so the most beautiful phrase, really sinister phrase, comes into existence, which is the king gives them this power. And it's the power of the bureaucracy that we all know now. But at the time it was called the alchemy of ink. And it's the power to turn writing on paper into money, into gold. And basically what he does is he creates this new caste of people who are able to more or less create ways to extract money that aren't taxation, but charging for official obligatory processes in order to get their own money. And you get these terrible system of incentives from the tax collectors who need to make their money. Like it comes from a genuine need, but instead of the king giving them part of his own riches, they have to make do with themselves, but with this new power that they've got. And that's the origin, for example, of Mexican notaries. In the United States, I don't know if you know this, but like anyone can be a notary. You just sign a paper. It's almost basically just a witness.
Right.
In Mexico, it is like one of the most powerful institutions in the country still. And they cloak it in this thing. It's about security. It's about formality. No, it isn't. It's about extracting value from people to do anything, like buying a house, whatever, in order to recompense previously the friends and bureaucrats of the king. Nowadays, the friends and bureaucrats that are in power. One of the corruption scandals that we recently saw in the previous election in 2024 was this recording, or it wasn't even a recording. No, it wasn't even a recording. It was so like blatant that they didn't realize it was corrupt, which was the PRI and the PAN, who are allied, this is the opposition parties, literally just saying, oh, you get this judgeship, you get this notaria, and they were divvying up who would get who would get which function of the state that isn't elected. And one of those were the notaries, which is this way of extracting money. And so this, again, we get a different sort of vicious feedback loop, which comes from the alchemy of ink, which is people who can do nothing but create different sorts of red tape that you can probably at some point realize, actually, the king's still very far away. What if I paid less tax and just paid this ink alchemist slightly more? And so that's where you start to get these origins, a very Mexican specific, or very Hispanic American form of corruption. Obviously, there's lots of other ways, right? There's always corruption everywhere all the time. There's smuggling, whatnot. But the way that it expresses itself in Mexico, which is often through the form of like, well, you could give me a bribe, or we can go through this whole bureaucratic song and dance, which is a Kafka nightmare. That, I think, comes very much from that particular origin. Again, right? It's sort of like me being a bit of a picker and chooser. I just think it's a wonderful story as well. There's lots of different origins, but I think that one is very unique to this part of the world.
I have to say, when you said the alchemy of ink, for a second there, I was like, are we talking about Wall Street? As like, the history of securities in the 20th century.
Yeah.
The problem with these origin stories is we're looking ultimately for a little bit of correlation, not necessarily causality. Like which story sounds better, right? But then there's really no way of knowing if this thing that happened 300, 500, 400, 500 years ago is actually the origin story of this, right? But if we come into the 20th century, there's maybe simpler origin stories. And yes, ultimately these can always be linked to like the broader history of the country and the region. But I think one of the things that can explain part of this idea of divvying up power and rights over the country can be linked back to post-revolutionary Mexico. And that really brings us into a more sort of contemporary view of the country, where the PRI which held power since the 1930s and until the year 2000 uninterruptedly, had a corporatist structure, right? Which was we can control the whole country sort of indirectly by speaking to representatives of all of the constituent parts of that country, be them workers, be them farmers, be them bankers, etc. And when you have this sort of Club de Toby, this sort of boys club, where 50 people de facto represent a country of millions, it's very easy to start divvying things up. And then it's very easy for, the laws to say one thing, but, behind closed doors, we, the 50 people who run the country, in reality, we can do things different.
Having said that, there isn't something inherently wrong with corporatism. Actually, if you like on paper, it's actually one of the best systems out there because it's basically representatives who represent every part of a democracy. And so what you do is, on paper, you get the union leader who's been democratically elected in theory. You get the bankers leader who has been democratically elected by the bankers. So like everyone's like been named by their peers, and then they go into negotiations with the state. And so it makes things far more efficient. The state is therefore like the judge. And then you discuss, you hash out your issues. You don't go on a strike. You don't beat your workers because you're getting together and having these conversations. And why are you allowed to have these conversations? You're not allowed to. It's all about power again, right? It's because the workers are unionized, so they're powerful. The capitalists are working together, so they're powerful. And the state is powerful in and of itself. The thing is, of course, after the revolution, because the economy had collapsed, because the state took so much control of like the country's workings, I think the state was overpowered. And so you get the version of corporatism that we get in Mexico, which is completely state-centric, in which you do not cross the state, whether you're a union or whether you're a capitalist. And what eventually happens is you bend the knee. And if you don't bend the knee, as if like maybe you're a bunch of workers who want wages that aren't starvation wages, and you elect a firebrand as your union leader, that's unacceptable. So let's get rid of that and let's work so that we can install a government-friendly union worker at the front of the union. And so you end up with lots of happiness and conciliation at the top, but it's all fake because it's all been imposed by the state.
Yeah, I definitely buy that, but I think there's a lot of things to unpack behind that. I think one of the big things is not just that the government was sort of overpowerful and just chose to impose itself on everyone. I think there's an element of, yes, the government need to be overpowerful because there'd been a very bloody revolution with lots of factions, and we need to get everything back in order. But then there's a huge element of extraordinary economic and demographic growth that follows in the course of the 20th century, where the corporate system, as you say, it can work, but it kind of needs to sort of morph relatively organically if we're going to continue to have a functional sort of democratic representation of the different groups. But if suddenly a particular group starts growing at outrageous percentages year on year, it's harder to keep that sort of control. And I think when we look at the numbers of population growth, it's just extraordinary. In 1800, there's 6 million people in Mexico. Back when it was much bigger than it is today. Then in 1900, there's 16 million people around. Today, it's 130 million. Keeping control of a country that's growing that quickly must be exceptionally hard.
That's puny numbers, right? That's tiny. That's less than half of the population of the United States, which has very efficient, or until Reagan, used to have very powerful, enormous unions. You've got the Chinese who do it incredibly efficiently. I don't think it has to do with population growth per se. I think actually the Mexican corporate system was very efficient at integrating, like even people who weren't formal workers, like people in slums, they were like slum inhabitant unions organized by the PRI back in the day.
No, I don't disagree with that. I think I'm not talking so much about the size of the population, but rather the rate of growth of the population. Having to incorporate very, very large numbers growing year on year is tricky.
Yeah, I wonder, and how do you think that's sort of contributed to corruption?
My point was that the corporate system became corrupt because instead of it being able to be a good corporate system that sort of continues to organically incorporate the different groups by being democratically elected and so on, the population grows so very quickly, and the state is still trying to keep control of everything with the existing sort of corporate structure, that it becomes sort of unmanageable. There's too much change happening too quickly in the different sections, and they just say, you know what, let's not deal with that because there's too much democracy for our taste right now. We're just going to impose people that are friendly with the government.
I guess you could add to that the movement of people, because not only was the population growing, but people were moving out of their historic areas, right? Like going back to the colonial times, had this policy where the state would concentrate disparate indigenous peoples so that they could be taxed and forced to work in a certain way. So I can see why massive growth, but also displacement of people, mostly from rural areas to the city, and mostly to Mexico City between the 1950s and 1970s. Just massive, unwieldy, uncontrollable, very high densely populated spaces. I guess one of the things I think we could do is we've started like half an hour ago, but whatever, is to start by defining corruption, like in a very loose sense, because I think people just say, "Oh, corruption, it's when you give a bit of money," right? But no, I think it's a deeper phenomenon than that. I think it's to do with the arbitrary use of power, and I think to your point, when you lose control, the systems that were in place before break down, and therefore it's easier to become arbitrary, either if it's a king from far, far away, or because the society's changing so quickly that you can't keep control.
Yeah, and maybe something that's important there is we want to talk about political corruption, because obviously the topic of corruption is massive, and particularly in Mexico that has so much corruption. There's no way there's no way around it. But we're not talking about the bribe that is demanded of you by the police or the additional money paid for, public works, etc. We're talking much deeper, much bigger political corruption in the way that very few end up controlling extraordinary amounts of the country, not necessarily in the most legal of ways.
This is such an interesting conversation because basically, I think you've weirdly channeled Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who was Mexico's president from 2018 to 2024, and he was a firebrand, very much anti the PRI, and he came in saying that's the like corruption has destroyed our country, which I think is true. He was right about that. We're going to come in and cleanse it. And he had a very Octavio Figueroa approach to it, which is if you clean the very highest echelons of power, it'll trickle down. And you can see I'm going to criticize this because I'm using that metaphor. The lack of the honesty will trickle down from the top. I mean, to be honest, it had worked. Like this mentality had worked when he was party leader. His whole thing was lead by example. And so people saw him out in the streets. And so they emulated him, whatever. But it's a very different kettle of fish when you're in government. And folksy phrases don't really change structural issues. He had this great phrase, which I love, which is, las escaleras se barren de arriba para abajo, which is literally true. It's you. If you're sweeping the stairs, you've got to sweep from the top to the bottom, which meant when you're cleaning the state, the very top has to be clean, and then you sweep to the bottom. But of course, you have to sweep the whole stairs, otherwise you just get a filthy middle bit of the steps.
Now, say what you want about AMLO, but God, is he good with little phrases?
Oh, like the entire Morena manifesto is literally just quotes, aphorisms, psalms from López Obrador. Por el bien de todos, primero los pobres. It's incredible. Yeah, they're very aware of it. They call it the mysticism of López Obrador. It's a religion.
It is. It's very culty, for sure.
Yeah. Back to the point of corruption. What I think is fascinating is that a big thing, I think the opposition disagrees with this and has always disagreed with this, but I think it's been very difficult to pin anything on López Obrador personally, which was he lives in his he's retired, he still lives in Mexico, he lives in Chiapas, he lives in a small, house, relatively humble. And he doesn't seem to have made billions as other presidents have done in the past. But the issue is, it kind of stops there. Like, there's loads of issues with his family. There's loads of issues with close contributors. And I think that's the issue, right? Like, and even if you go beyond that, even if you accept the Morena discourse, which is no, it's all slander, even then you get terrible corruption. In the Mexico Political Economist just last week, we published a graphic showing the biggest corruption scandal to hit the Claudia Sheinbaum administration, which has started a year ago, and it's already one of the biggest in living memory. And it's sort of perfect because it's like not only the perfect example of how like this top-only approach fails to corruption, but also shows how much you can do with political corruption without having like a puppet master at the top. I'll tell you what it is in a sec, but you look like you want to say something.
I'm really eager to hear the details about this because I only know the top line.
Yeah, so basically I'm talking about the recent oil theft scandal. Compared to other scandals from the past, it's titanic. It's 600 billion pesos unaccounted for from oil, and they call it sort of fiscal theft. And the way it worked broadly was this very sprawling network that included the army, it included government officials, and included business people and customs officials. And what's fascinating to me is if you compare it to other previous scandals, even in the López Obrador age, the Segalmex scandal was the biggest one during his time, which is big government agencies controlled by very powerful people who lean on their workers, other sort of like mid-ranking but still upper like echelon people, to create shell companies and to move the entire apparatus of the state in order to extract billions of pesos. This one seems very different because at least till now, and we might find out, it turns out, like the top official in this government agency was actually in charge of it. But as it seems right now, and the narrative the government is trying to push, you can see why the government would want to push this narrative, but we'll put that aside for now. The narrative they're trying to push is that this was a sort of middle to lower rung operation. And you can sort of see how it works because it is such a sprawling network that works on a modus operandi that doesn't require big shell companies, but is actually just a series of different corruption schemes that allow you to get through oil and not pay taxes and stuff like that. And so that to me is what's interesting. Ultimately, you don't need a big boogeyman at the top. There is structural corruption, and that is also political corruption.
So, one question. First, you said 600 billion pesos. That amounts to $30-ish billion. That's a lot of money. How much time are we talking about? Like over
Yes.
how much time did this happen?
So you've hit the nail on the head. Like I probably forgot to mention the most important thing, which is the fact that the reason you could accumulate so much money with sort of smallish, small fry stealing is that when it's this lower level stuff, it's more likely to go unperceived. And you can see that it had been going on for years. We don't know how many sexenios, when that's presidential terms in Mexico, it had been going on for. So once you sort of gather that amount of data and you say, well, this is how they did it and this is how much they stole, it's an enormous amount of money. But you can't be pinned on, oh, this one very corrupt person came into government and they started this system. It's a system that goes far beyond any one individual.
No, certainly, and I think that's always been the case. And I think no one would have thought really that the corruption was only at the top. But I think one of the things that AMLO was right in, at least the rhetoric, not the way he maybe implemented his approach, but the rhetoric is these organizations, political organizations in Mexico, government organizations in Mexico, are very hierarchical. You need sign-offs on everything. We talked about Pemex, for example, and I saw it, live, how everything needed to be signed by everyone, so everyone was aware of what was going on. You need to go all the way to the top, so there's no pretending that they didn't know. So, of course, because everyone's involved in one way or another, either passively or actively. Everyone, it's not just the top that's responsible, but people very high up top are aware, and people very high up top are allowing it.
This is the ongoing question in Mexican politics, I think, since democracy began, at least. And before it was rumors, but it was still the conversation, which is how much do the very top people know about very big corruption going on all around them? What's the great irony is that for years, people were furious on the left, people in Morena, López Obrador, and all the people who supported him hated Calderón. And when it came out that his security minister had been working, or at least had been filtering stuff to the cartels. He's now in jail in New York for that. They said it's impossible that he didn't know. He must have known. It's literally impossible that the man at the top doesn't know what his right hand is doing when it comes to security. And then, lo and behold, a year into Claudia Sheinbaum's administration, it comes out that the man who used to be López Obrador's right-hand man, the man who is currently the boss of the Morena party in the National Senate, Adán Augusto López, his right-hand man for security when he was governor of the state of Tabasco was the leader of a cartel. Like worse than Garcia Luna, who was the Calderón equivalent, the right-wing equivalent, the terrible man who must have known. We've got literally the same example and probably worse. And of course what they're saying is he knew absolutely nothing. He can't have known. And it's just crazy. Like they've completely forgotten their logic. They've gone completely the other way now. It's always there's a lot of Schadenfreude to it, and one kind of wants to think that they did know because it's sort of like just desserts. But at the same time, like people don't know. I've spoken to a lot of security journalists, like from Mexico, from the United States, who've covered the Garcia Luna case very, very closely, and even they aren't really sure how Calderón could have known this, or even how like Garcia Luna could have known certain things about the stuff that he was supposed to have been in charge of. We want to pin the blame on like baddies, and this is going back to the López Obrador logic. Like we want to find the big bad baddie so we can be over and done with this corruption business and just get on with being a normal country. But the issue is, of course, when it's structural, you can't just sweep the stairs at the top and then stop there. You do have to do a deep cleanse. Sort of pivoting slightly here. There is a very sinister logic to cleansing the state of corruption. We see it every single day when a new, very powerful government, dictatorial or democratic, comes in. They say, we're going to drain the swamp. We're going to purge the corrupt. And what you end up getting is a political purge that often ignores the most corrupt people because they tend to be very Machiavellian about where they stand. And it's the people who get in the way politically that you decide are the most corrupt. You get this a lot in this fuel theft story in Mexico, Huachicol, in which you get generals who are with the cartels working with generals who are actually honest, and the honest ones often get thrown into jail because they're the ones showing the government where the theft is happening. And then the higher level general says, oh, that's very interesting and very accurate. Why don't you step over here with me? You get that also at a higher political level. People in Mexico are sick of corruption. And what's tragic about that is that that was weaponized against the Mexican justice system. Everyone agrees that Mexican justice is broken and needed a reform. But the way the Morena government imposed a judicial reform onto the country was on the narrative that they were going to cleanse the judicial branch of corruption, and then did everything they could to probably make it more corrupt and not address almost any of the issues with corruption that existed within that system. But it gave them far more control over the judicial branch. And I think, I mean, we've had this debate for a long time, but as the reform has been implemented and as it has unfolded, it has become very clear that it's a very amateurish approach to political cleansing, cloaked as this sort of democratic anti-corruption purge.
The other problem I see in all of this, like, I don't disagree with anything you've said, but the problem I see is that there seems to be no solution, right? Because when the cleansing is at the top, well, it doesn't work because it's structural. Well, let's cleanse the whole damn thing. Let's get rid of all of them. Let's completely change the way we do things. And the problem is that people, that the system is corrupt. Let's get rid of the system. And now we elect them. Let's do it completely differently. But then that doesn't work either. And then, it should have been done in X way or Y way. But I don't actually see anyone agreeing on what the way forward is. But I do hear a lot of complaining about what has been done.
Yeah, I mean, you can see lots of different ways in which corruption has been addressed. I think the Italians have done it the Italians have done it in a very impressive way, mostly through bravery, which is you do need this certain degree of top-bottom approach, which is the president, in this case, someone like Claudia Sheinbaum, needs to say, enough is enough. I'm going to start getting rid of people who are clearly problematic, people who are like almost certainly in cahoots with the cartels. The government of the United States has banned them from entering the US because of links to cartels. And so like it's almost at this point, even if we're doing the presumption of innocence, which Morena, by the way, does not do with their opponents, but even if we do apply the presumption of innocence, I think it might be the time for you to step aside from this very important and powerful position you've got to have someone else come in. I think she can't do that because of politics. Believe it or not, even though Morena has a supermajority, they want to govern with that supermajority, and therefore they need to keep all the parts in their coalition together. And a lot of those parts are very corrupt. And so you can see by the way Claudia Sheinbaum is governing that she's aware of the corruption. She's trying to prevent it from seeping into the less corrupt parts of a government. And then you get a whole bunch of other issues, namely centralization. You get people who you can see are relatively honest people at the top of different administrations, different government departments, and they have all the control. They're completely in possession of that department, and therefore they're very inefficient because they have no trusted advisors. They can't delegate work because you don't know who's corrupt and who isn't, because they haven't done a purge, because it's politically unfeasible. And so what do? Well, if you were brave, or let's forget bravery. What could you do given the situation and given what Morena wants to achieve? You want to use the supermajority you've got, and they've got a bunch of reforms they want to keep passing, and I think that's why they're rushing them through. They're very oftenly shoddily written reforms, so they can just shove everything they want to get done through as soon as possible. And then by the time we get to the midterms, I think there is a chance they'll lose. I mean, the opposition in this country is so inept, they might not. But there is a chance they'll lose the supermajority. They'll still be very powerful. And then that gives Claudia Sheinbaum a bit more wiggle room to start doing a bit more of the not purging. I mean, this is the issue, right? Is it purging? Is it cleansing? We'll hear both sides of that argument whenever she does do it, if she does it. And then eventually she'll have to come to terms with the corrupt elements of our party.
I think this reminds me of another moment in Mexican history. And it seems like Morena, and Sheinbaum in particular, is facing something similar, which is coming to this sort of crux as has happened before. When Porfirio Diaz is governing the country, the Mexican dictator who governed for 30 years, over 100 years ago, at the beginning he's quite effective. And the way he achieves everything is by sort of a mixture of negotiation and centralizing power. And it works really well, but it all kind of depends on him. And it might have worked if it might have continued to work if he'd implemented significant reform, allowed for changeover of people, and so on. The system he created worked so well in the way that was set up that if he tried to change anything, everything would have probably just fallen apart. And I think this is where Sheinbaum is headed, where Morena is a disaster. It's such an eclectic group of people, some of them very corrupt, some we don't know, some unsure, etc. But it allows them to govern. But the moment that she starts, taking away pieces, it's like a big Jenga tower, and it might completely fall apart. So there's the risk that, facing that risk, she might not actually do anything ever.
To mix our metaphors, it's not so much a Jenga tower as a house of cards. Porfirio Diaz was a perfect example, right? He created this seemingly very solid economy, political structure, etc. And then he gives one American journalist one interview and the entire system collapses. That's an inside Mexican Revolution joke, which I will not explain. I think that that's one of the big reasons why, despite all these people, this neo-Porfirian argument coming around in Mexico, which says we need a strong man. Porfirio Diaz was a hero. Sure, he was a dictator, but he brought development and economic growth to Mexico. He created the Mexican middle class. That may all be true, but that all went to hell in 1910. And so it doesn't matter how tall your house of cards is, a small gust of wind will knock the whole thing over in a second. What's interesting is this brings us to the most problematic but actually very effective part of the story, which is the Trump administration. The Trump administration really wants to deal with the issue of fentanyl, and they've directly blamed Mexico for it, so that's that. And so drug cartels are now terrorist organizations. You know the story. What's interesting to me is that the trade negotiations are going on one side, the USMCA negotiations, whatever. Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, is in charge of the security negotiations. And he's really happy with Mexico in public. But I think very clearly in private, he has a very serious chat with Claudia Sheinbaum every time he gets her on the phone or whenever he's in Mexico City. And he says to her, I need you to take far stronger action against your people who are clearly corrupt. And she's been resisting so far, but it's such a good excuse to take action. Like, her party will hate her, for it, no matter what excuse she uses. But I think that's the sort of the uses and abuses of American power can also be used to one's own advantage, which is in the same way that a lot of economic, like often sometimes unpopular or controversial government actions like tariffs, whatever, often you would argue on the merits of that, whereas now they can say, oh, no, I mean, the Americans forced us to. And I think you could sort of go that way with corruption as well, which is, at least for the people that the Americans have in their crosshairs, now, I won't say all their names because there's too many, but it's lots of Mexican governors, etc. I think you can actually start making a case for it. But that's on one side. I think there's another part of the Sheinbaum administration that doesn't depend on American pressure, which I do admire, and I think seems to be working. We'll see. Which is the low-level corruption, political corruption across Mexico. They've been showing in states like the state of Mexico, which surrounds Mexico City, famously very corrupt, that they can really work to expunge corruption at the state and the local level. And so it's federal forces or state forces coming in and literally swooping in like a SWAT team across a massive state, coming in and arresting police chiefs, mayors, and it's very spectacular. It's all done at the same time. Dozens of people arrested in order to get rid of that corruption at that level, which is, by the way, where most of the corruption in Mexico happens. If you go to a federal government agency as a citizen, it's actually very, very, very unlikely that you'll be asked for a bribe or whatever. I think that system has been cleaned through. The issue is when you meet a municipal policeman or when you need to do a local bit of paperwork, that's when you really come across the hardcore and pretty blatant corruption that people think of.
Definitely. I mean, I remember being 17, I want to say 16 maybe, and beginning to deal with the realities of Mexico that you hear about at home, but you're not really exposed to them. And I'd gone out partying, and I had lost my wallet, and I'd lost every card inside of it. And then, of course, I had to go recover them. And my parents wisely said, "Well, your mess, you clean it up. Go figure it out." So I had to go and get all these cards. And I was at the municipal palace in Naucalpan, which is a municipality just north of Mexico City in the state of Mexico, part of the greater Mexico City. And I show up, and first, the amount of bureaucracy was extraordinary. Like, you, at one point, you're like, okay, I'll pay anyone. I don't care. Just please give me my things. But I wanted to follow, the rules and whatnot. So that they told me I needed a letter from a judge saying that I'd actually had lost my things and blah, blah. So I went to the judge. Mind you, it's like 11 a.m. and the judge's not there. And I'm like, oh, when's he supposed to be here? 2 hours ago. I'm like, all right, fine. So I'm there waiting, and he shows up. And when he shows up, he sits behind this man's like a caricature of himself. He's massive, like he's missing a button, like he's got like food stains. It's ridiculous. When he sits down behind this counter, with him is a policeman with his arms crossed, and there's a sign above him that says that this document that I needed only cost 50 pesos, right? So I'm like, okay, I need this document, please. The guy looks at me and he says, it's 200 pesos. And there's this moment where I look at the judge, I look at the sign, I look at the judge, I look at the cop, and I just take out my 200 pesos, like, yes, sir, here you go.
That's incredibly cheap, by the way. Like you got off easy there. It's crazy. Everyone always goes, and this is why it's such a structural issue, right? Everyone goes, I'm very honest. I would never pay a bribe, and they're like, of course you wouldn't. Now, please step into the Chinese water torture chamber while you wait for the judge. And then by the time you've been sleep deprived for 15 weeks and you don't know who you are anymore, maybe you would pay 200 pesos for the bribe, right?
And we don't want a bribe. We want a cooperation, really, for the children of the police fund, or whatever they want to call it.
Yeah, which by the way takes us all the way back to the alchemy of ink. The government has its processes, and they're all very nice and liberal, and they're well-meaning, and then they have just these terrible systems, this terrible precarity at the lower government levels, where these people, I mean, they're not falling over starving like the previous Spanish colonial officials were. But like, there's different incentives now that force them into this sort of behavior, which again takes me back to the fact that it's not about having nice people at the top, because in Mexico, often the alternative to corruption is death. There's a saying here called plata o plomo, silver or lead. And often when you deal with organized crime, you're forced to be corrupt or you're killed. It's such a difficult issue to deal with, and it's so unfair that both the media, public opinion, and government officials simplify it into this weird moralistic question about we just need the right people in the right places, which is true, but not in the simplistic way they're describing it.
Certainly, I fully agree with that. But what you're saying, plata o plomo, the story about me being 16 and so on, and plenty of other stories we can tell, these are things
keep getting younger in this story.
No, but all these stories, they predate AMLO. They predate Sheinbaum. This is the Mexico we grew up in. So clearly, it was already a very corrupt Mexico. And these stories happen not only in Mexico City, we can stories from Monterrey, from Guadalajara, from Veracruz, you name it. But something that is a constant is when you speak to people now, they will tell you that things are a lot worse in Mexico. And it's not just people, it's the rankings. So the Corruption Perception Index has placed Mexico, I think, at by far a historic low, from being around 70, I think, on the Calderon, to being in rank number 129 most recently. So how do you see that? Is it actually that bad?
I mean, I'll be very honest. Mexico, as always, is a very unfair and unequal and very diverse country. And what is very clear to me is that me living in cushy Mexico City, I haven't experienced much corruption because of just like my life, right? Like, to start with, I don't own a car, which I love. I'm lucky enough to not need one, but it also means I'm kind of exempt from a lot of the corruption that goes on, which tends to be, traffic cop sort of corruption. But then you go to other parts of the country, and again, right, far away from the metropole, the king's distant, suddenly corruption gets worse, right? Because you're further away from the center of power. But I kind of hate those rankings. They're definitely approaching this in a very specific way, which is a perfectly legitimate way, which is how people experience corruption, right? And like, what sort of corruption do you see? But just the size of corruption in places like the City of London and Wall Street, where all the narco money gets laundered, all of it. The banks have offices and people that deal directly with like El Chapo. So like, when you say like, oh, these silly little Mexicans, look at them being so corrupt, bribing their local judges, and then like you get this massive just churning of money in the background from these countries that lecture everyone else. It's always such a difficult conversation to have. Corruption is definitely a transnational phenomenon. And I think, funnily enough, the Trump administration and the Sheinbaum administration understand that really well. And that's why they're working so closely. When it comes to guns coming into Mexico, that's corruption. And it's corruption that starts in the US. When it comes to laundering money, it's money that starts through corruption in Mexico and then ends up in corruption in the United States. And so I think people are starting to wake up to the fact that corruption isn't a national characteristic. It's very much defined by the structures in which we exist. I mean, very Marxist approach, but there you are. Never mind. I think I'd love to conclude on a very specific idea, because I think corruption is such a broad idea that everyone takes it to mean whatever they want. The rankings have a very legitimate approach to it. And I think, I'm not saying they're lying. I'm just saying it's half the story, right? It's a bit of it's the other side of the black legend. And I think when we're talking about Mexican politics and Morena, they were supposed to clean things up and they're just as corrupt. They're the same terrible people. I also think there's a bit of mixing of the terms, especially by people in the opposition who aren't particularly good faith. And that's the corruption of Morena. And there's the corruption of Morena, which is corrupt officials who do corruption, abuses of power, asking for bribes, etc. That's corruption in my mind. But then there's the corruption, the moral corruption of Morena. And I think that's more about vibes and less about actual corruption. It's a two-pronged story. And I think a lot of the focus, annoyingly, has been focused on the moral corruption. You get people complaining about how they're supposed to be the party of the poor, and yet this Morena senator traveled in business class, and the president's son, the former president's son, López Obrador's son, who is now a bigwig in Morena, he went on holiday to Japan, and it's just such a crappy argument, because that's not corruption. They're using if they're using funds that aren't theirs to get there, or the trip is a bribe, that's corruption. But it's very clearly them using their salary to go out and travel the land. And it's just based on this moralistic argument that Morena was supposed to be for the poor, but actually, look at them, they're going to Japan, which, whatever. It distracts us from the main issues with corruption, which are actually killing people and which actually make it loses Mexico so much money and so many lives every year that I would argue that corruption is by far the biggest problem in Mexico today. And it's about time we started to actually focus on how to deal with it structurally, and not so much with these fairy tales we tell ourselves, both in the opposition and with the Morena.
And let's be clear, I don't think that Noroña or Andrés Manuel López Obrador's son are paying for those trips and those business class tickets with their salary. But I get your point. we should be.
I mean, this is the thing, right? It reminds me of when Evo Morales, there was that coup in Bolivia, and they kicked out the Bolivian president, Evo Morales, and they went into his house. And I mean, Bolivia's a much poorer country. I don't want to make light of it, but also it was kind of hilarious. I'm sorry. I mean, they went into the presidential house, and there was this tiny little room, barren little room with a treadmill in it, and they're like, look at how he lived like a king. I'm like, dude, it's a room with a treadmill in it. I mean, I know different standards, inequality, Latin America, but I think it's difficult. It's important to see the wood for the trees. I think Noroña probably can actually afford a business class ticket because he gets quite a hefty salary. He's not getting paid peanuts. Sorry, Noroña is the senator, by the way. We know it's such a big story in Mexico that we know what we're talking about when we say the senator who traveled in business class. But for those who don't know it, this is Gerardo Fernández Noroña, very much a populist in the Morena tradition, and he's a tall man who likes to have a bit of extra legroom, clearly.
Fair, but I mean, there's also allegations of houses and cars and so on, which are a separate conversation. But yes, I get the point, which is we should be more concerned about the houses than we should be about the fact that he flew business class, because he's a senator in a G20.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so that's. I think, have you got anything else to say about corruption? Should I bribe you to stop contradicting me?
There's one thing, which is going back to this moral corruption. Who knows if corruption is actually worse under AMLO and Sheinbaum under Morena? Because there's a lot of rumor. We've talked about rumor before on this podcast. Rumor is a big part of Mexican politics. And everyone's certain, at least everyone I talk to, that corruption is much worse in Mexico. But no one has any evidence, right? And they're certain of a lot of things that they can't actually give me facts and figures for. They're just like, this is the way I feel it is. And everyone I speak to also feels that way, so it must be that way. But ultimately, that's the way the rankings work, right? It's how do you perceive corruption and how much corruption there actually is. And I think this moral corruption element might be behind a lot of the perception of there being high amounts of corruption, because they're saying one thing. They're saying that they're not going to behave, as rich people, blah, blah, blah. And then they do. So you're not following suit with your own rhetoric. Then how can I believe anything else? And then, sure, the opposition and the rich might have their own reasons for disagreeing with or for perceiving corruption. But the average Mexican is different. And it's this moral corruption rhetoric and the lack of consistency that might be behind the much higher perceived corruption in recent years.
I think depends on the ranking, of course. I do kind of hate the how do you feel about this specific very complex trend? But yeah, as we've said before, in a democracy that does actually does matter, because these people do eventually.
That is how we run governments.
Yeah, exactly. I think so. Fair enough. But there are different metrics. There are different ways of measuring corruption. That's probably a story for a different day. But yeah, I love talking about corruption with you, Tavo. I love your stories. You always get yourself in some pickles. I'm starting to worry.
It happens a lot. That's probably a good thing that I live in a country where I can't get myself into trouble that often.
Switzerland is a place with no corruption, said nobody ever.
Right, but corruption only really matters if you've got hundreds of millions of ill-gotten money, which is not my case.
Yeah, well, yet. Fingers crossed. Yeah. And with that happy thought,
I'm Tavo Figueroa.
And I'm Alex Gonzalez-Omrod.
And this is Mexico, the podcast.
Every 2 weeks, we're telling about Mexican corruption, about Mexican politics, Mexican economics, and all the sinister little rumors that we hear on this side of the grapevine.
Subscribe to the Mexico Political Economist, give us a like, leave us a comment, and see you next time.
Toodaloo.